We're in James. We're finishing up James chapter 2. As a way of reminder, we've been talking about faith without works and how they go hand in hand. You can't really have one without the other. One without the other doesn't mean anything. We finished up last week talking about Abraham and the great faith he had in the fact that, they prayed and prayed for a son. God blessed him with Isaac. And now God's asked them to sacrifice him. And without hesitation or questioning, Abraham followed through to the point where God stopped him in the end and provided a ram to take his place. Why? What kind of faith does it take for someone like Abraham to do what he did? What do you think? What kind of faith is that? Unwavering, for one.
Yeah, a tremendous amount of faith.
Trust.
How much trust he had in God.
So what was the promise God gave Abraham?
You have more ocean, sand.
What was Isaac supposed to be? What's that?
His prodigy, the line that came through.
He was supposed to be leader of nations and all kinds of good things God had planned for him. And now he tells Abraham to sacrifice him. But Abraham had the faith that if God says to do it, he'll make sure it works out no matter how it comes out. Is that not a good lesson for us?
Amen.
Sometimes we hesitate to pray about things because we've already preconceived what we think the outcome's going to be. Don't we? Joe?
Don't you think it was kind of a learning process even for Abraham? Because he'd made his mistakes. He lied about Sarah. And
Right.
and he...
You mean he wasn't perfect?
No, he was not perfect. But I think he realized through those things, don't you?
Of course.
Without trusting God.
And who was, in the case of Abraham and also Rahab, we're going to read about in a minute, who really needed to be proven their faithfulness? Did God know how faithful Abraham was? So who got proven? Didn't Abraham's faith and the way he acted out prove to himself who he trusted? Isn't that what James kind of tells us in chapter 1 we read a month ago? That count it all joy when you fall into various trials because you're testing your faith. And then when you get through that, who's strengthened by it? You are. See, God knows where I'm at. But I got to prove to myself. And that when I do that, that's going to strengthen me. And that's the same thing here with Abraham. I'm sure Abraham, all the way up to the place where we were going to sacrifice, was going, oh man, my wife's going to get mad at me when I get home. No. But you got to know there's those doubts. But Abraham didn't waver. He did exactly what God told him to do. Good morning, Grandpa. He did exactly what God asked him to do. Because of that, God's called him what? You don't have to guess. It's in verse 23. His friend. Abraham was called his friend. David was called a man after God's own heart. But don't you want to be in that category? Don't you want to be a friend to our Lord and Savior? If you have faith but no works, you're not going to be that friend. If you do good things but you don't really have the faith and you're not doing them for the right reason, you're not going to be that friend. But through complete obedience and faith, Abraham is called his friend. And then we'll read verse 24. It says, "You see that a person is justified by his works, and not by faith alone." Now, notice what it says there. It doesn't say just for his works. It says for his works and faith alone. So you can't have one or the other. They got to go hand in hand. Because it doesn't work that way. If you believe in something wholeheartedly, you're going to act on it. If you're just faking it, your actions are going to show it. I heard an interview yesterday with Deion Sanders. Most of you know who Deion Sanders is. Famous athlete, right? Well, he did a lot of showboating when he was an athlete. And in this interview, he said, all that was to promote myself. Wasn't who I was. I didn't do drugs. I didn't do all these different things. And they asked him, if you're going to tell young people who should, what athlete or whatever would be their idol, who would you say? And he says, I would tell them Jesus. He says, because I would tell them to be careful. He says, when I was playing, you seen me a couple hours a week. You didn't know what I did. He says, couple hours a day. You didn't know what I did the other 22 hours. He says, when you see these people on TV, actors, athletes, and all that, he says, you don't know who they are. You just know who they're pretending to be. We need to make sure that we're not pretending to be Christ-like. We got to make sure that we are Christ-like 24/7, not a couple hours a day when we're here at church. It's got to be constant. Like Abraham, our life needs to reflect that. Make sense? Yeah.
In Abraham's case here, he had the faith, and he was probably doing all kinds of things at home that were works, good works and that. But God asked him to do a specific work, and that was to go up on the mountain.
Right.
He could have said, but, I got faith, and I've done all these other works. I don't need to do that part.
Right.
And I think it's the same with us. We can have faith, and we can do a lot of works, but sometimes it's not necessarily exactly what God wants us to look at. It's what we want to look at.
Right.
We'll give to the needy, or we'll spend our time helping the neighbor rake the yard, or whatever. But when he tells us, I want you to climb that mountain and sacrifice, that's when we want to draw the line and say, I've done enough works, and I've got faith, I'm good. I don't need to do any more.
Right.
But when it comes to climbing the mountain and then sacrificing it, that's when that true faith with works comes out.
And it also, when it's behind the scenes and not in the limelight. Abraham didn't take a crowd up on the hill to watch the sacrifice. He went by himself with his son. So a lot of times we do things for show. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen in our Christianity. It doesn't happen. So we look down at verse 25. It says, and in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Y'all remember the account of Rahab? You find it in Joshua 6, but also referenced it in Hebrews 11, 30 and 31. And we know what Hebrews chapter 11 is, the faith chapter. Rahab knew that by her doing this, she could be put to death. By her aiding them, she could have been put to death. Yet God used her. And that's another lesson in that. Remember what James talked about earlier before this section? Not to judge somebody, not to be partial. Would we have thought to use someone like her for good? Honestly? No, because we had put her on a level that may usually have been below us, wouldn't we? But God's seen her heart. Even though she had fallen into a wayward life, God's seen her heart. And hopefully she made changes. So, and if you think about it, how ironic is that you put someone like Abraham, who we all hold high in esteem, and then someone like Rahab in the same context. God is not a respecter of people. Did you say? I seen you lip something.
God is a respecter of the heart.
Of the heart. Of the heart. He cares about what's inside. He doesn't care about what we look like on the outside. And that's a good thing for most of us. But we need to make sure our heart's in the right place. So important. Abraham put God first. Rahab put God first. And we need to put God first. And then in this section he closes out in verse 26, for the body apart from the spirit is dead. So also faith apart from works is dead. Do you think James is doing a good job driving that point home? Our body without a spirit would be nothing, right? Just be a mass of nothing. Decaying matter, if you want to get blunt. And so is our Christianity. If we're not faithful to God and obedient. Again, it goes hand in hand. It goes hand in hand. No excuses. See, the thing about Christianity is it's black and white. The world has all these shades of gray in the middle of it. Because everybody wants to say, or at least majority of people want to say, yeah, I'm a Christian. But do they have faith with works? Or do they have faith without works like the demons? See, it's easy to believe in something. But it takes the right heart to commit and act upon something. Just like the illustration I gave last week, and I think Dina uses it every now and then, I've heard. The guy who went across Niagara Falls on a tightrope, and then he did it with a wheelbarrow, and everyone's cheering him. You believe I could do it with somebody in it? Everybody cheers. Yes, you can. I'll take a volunteer. See, that is, those people had faith but no works. They believed he could do it, but I ain't getting in the wheelbarrow. Can't say as I blame them, but see, that's how a lot of Christians live their life. Jill and Jeff.
She wasn't Jewish. She was a Moabite. So right there it goes to show you.
Right.
She converted to it, but she wasn't. So she must have listened somewhere.
She heard it.
Heard it somewhere.
She heard it and believed it, just like the Samaritan woman. She heard about him. She didn't quite understand everything. She knew that the father of Abraham, but she didn't quite understand. We need to make sure, one, people hear it. Some of that's going to come up in the lesson this morning, but we got to make sure people hear it. That is works, isn't it? Us sharing what we know, is that not works? Jeff?
What's the difference between works and obedience?
What's the difference between works and obedience? You can't be obedient if you don't do things.
But I mean,
Action.
when we are obedient to His word, isn't everything we do a work?
It is.
When we
If we're
obey the
obedient,
gospel-
yes.
When we obey the gospel, we get baptized. because it's a commandment.
Right.
And we're obeying that command. If it says, love your neighbor, love your enemy, be kind to those that are orphans, widows, those are all commands for us to do.
Right.
And if we do them, it's a work.
It's a work.
Yeah. So when you come to, you know.
You can't really separate obedience and
Exactly.
works. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing, and yet we cannot please God unless we obey His commands.
That's right. And what He's laid out for us to be obedient to dictates our works. Make sense? Yeah. Huey.
Two important points in verse 26. First of all, death is defined in such a way that we can understand that the body apart from the spirit is dead.
Right.
Many of us looked at people on corpses and realized something's missing. Secondly, it repudiates materialism. The last part of that verse, faith apart from works is dead.
Yeah.
Sometimes we read through that and we don't
Get that.
zero in on it. But
Yeah, and if, to Huey's point, if you've ever, I've been by many of bedsides being an elder, as probably Huey has. And once somebody passes, you immediately notice a change. There is a change. Not only in the physical look, the color drops almost immediately, but there is a change, there is a feeling of something different. You don't have to be told. And see, that's our Christianity. When you're not doing the right thing, it's obvious. You can only pretend so long, and people notice. And so we need to be careful of that, because it's not that you're just weaker, you're dead. Once you fall away, once you're not working, your faith is dead. You can't survive, much like anything else. Now we're going to get into chapter 3. Does anybody have any more comments on the end of chapter 2 there?
I was looking at back when Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and servants came with him. And he
Right.
says, we're going to go up,
Stay here.
but we'll be back.
Yeah.
He didn't say, I will be back. He said,
Yeah.
we will be back.
He had confidence. Whatever it was, even if he meant, I don't know, bringing the corpse down, I don't know, but he had the total confidence, no matter what could happen, God was going to make it right. And that's the thing that we struggle with. Dean?
But he had made a promise, and he knew that promise. He didn't know how God was going to do it.
Right.
But he knew there was a promise to him and his son and his offspring.
God would make it work.
But, yeah, he didn't know how. He knew he asked him to sacrifice. He just didn't know, but he had faith.
Right. And faith that was shown by his works. It wasn't just, I'll do it later and let me know. Jude?
There was also faith on Isaac's part, because he questioned, where is the sacrifice?
Right.
Abraham told him, God will provide. So there was a huge faith, and what an example that Abraham was to Isaac in the lesson, and he was to go on to be as great as Abraham.
And look at the faith he had in his dad. And then God did provide, right? He provided a ram for it. That's a whole sermon in itself, a whole lesson in itself, the faith that Abraham had at that point. And you look at a lot of the, think about it, all the apostles, Noah, Moses, all these ones that we read about, look at the faith it took to do what they did. We studied a few weeks ago that Christ told Peter he was going to die a martyr. But Peter kept on. Did you have a question?
Is Abraham Isaac's dad?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So you see the faith. These weren't anybody special. These are men and women like you and I. So does that give us any excuses?
No.
None. We can look at Paul and Peter and Abraham and Moses, and the list could go on, and we can say, wow, how great are they? So why can't we be that great? Isn't that the lesson? Isn't that why we have them as examples? Isn't that why Hebrews 11 spends a whole chapter telling us about these people's faith, that we can have it? If we can't have it, God wouldn't have included it, would he? But we all can obtain that. But that faith takes works. Yeah, loud.
We are Christ's son if we do what he says.
Exactly. Excuse me.
That's all I.
So, chapter 3. Chapter 3 is, for any of us who have taught or attempted to preach or to do anything, is a hard swallow, isn't it? Excuse me. Sorry. Chapter 3 starts out, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with a greater strictness. Now, with that start, is James trying to discourage teachers? No. No. What is he doing? He says that teachers will be judged stricter. Why? Anybody?
Their influence.
Influence?
He's trying to express the seriousness of it.
What's that?
He's trying to express to them the seriousness of that role.
And the responsibility.
Exactly. I pray a couple of times, well, more than a couple of times, but a couple of times every morning before I teach class, and all through the week while I'm studying, that I understand what I'm studying, so that when I relay it, I'm relaying the gospel. And I do know that I could make mistakes every now and then, so if I do, please tell me. I won't get upset. If I disagree, we'll study, but if you're right, you've helped me out a lot. So we do this together. It doesn't mean that we're not going to make a mistake. But we need to be careful when we are teaching somebody. Now, who are teachers? I'm up here talking to a group. But if you're teaching somebody about Christ one-on-one, are you not a teacher too? So we all are teachers. We all have the same obligation to teach the truth. Jeff?
In Galatians, it tells us, even if we or an angel from heaven preach another gospel other than the one we preach to you, he'll be eternally condemned. That's putting a lot of pressure on the teacher. Because if you do teach something other than what this book says, another gospel, there's not much hope for you. That's why it's so important to make sure that what you are teaching or preaching is correct.
Exactly. Joe?
Well, teachers talk more. You know, they talk more because they're teaching.
Right.
So they're going to be, so he's warning you, you're going to be, you want to be in that position where you are going to be judged by God because you are speaking. You're speaking more words than somebody who's listening. So he was tasked and saying, so does that, because you have to take it serious, because you are talking more. And that's what this whole chapter is kind of about, right?
Yeah. I had back in the 90s when I was deacon over youth, I was actually the youth leader. We had a large youth group, well over 30, 35 kids, and more on some days. Well, one of the local Christian churches called me up one day and said they wanted to meet with me. And what they wanted to do, because we were pulling some of their kids into our youth group, they wanted to do stuff together. So I said, well, we have a few little issues then. I said, if we're going to do that, you guys are going to need to change to be scriptural. And I'm meeting with the preacher and the youth minister. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, first of all, the Bible instructs us to take the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week. You guys do it once a month. You also don't push baptism. You don't say that people need to be baptized. Well, we believe that. No. I said, you believe it? Have you both been baptized? Yeah, we've both been baptized. Do you preach that? Well, no, it's not comfortable. I said, so you believe the truth, but you don't preach the truth. And you want me, who believes in the truth, to join my kids with yours? Because if I do, I'm going to teach them this. But you'll have to let your kids come to our events. We're not going to go to your events with your speakers if you're not going to be true to the scriptures. That was the last lunch we ever had. So, but the point is, it's important. It's not only important that the teacher knows what he's teaching. The teacher needs to understand that. Needs to know what they're teaching and be obedient to what they're teaching and to relay that to who they're teaching. Yubi?
It's so burdensome because when you're teaching somebody, you're teaching salvation. That person could be lost or gained to God. And if we do something incorrect, we would be responsible as teachers, and that's what he's saying. There's such a responsibility to hold to and defend and teach the truth.
And it's a big responsibility. And if you go through, James is going to really, really drive this point home, isn't he? Verse 2, it says, for we all stumble in many ways. In other words, okay, you're not going to be perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. There's our out. We're going to make mistakes. And there's been several times, some of you know, that if I don't quote a right verse, or if I say something after I review it on YouTube, I'll come back and tell you I misspoke here. Or the other day on the Lord's table, I was so upset because I gave the wrong chapter, and I noticed during communion people are trying to find where I'm reading, and that bugged me a lot. So I came back and told you I messed up. But it's important that we relay the scriptures. If you don't understand something in the scriptures, please don't try to teach it. And if you make a mistake, correct it. And there's no room for discussion there, period. Teach it if you know it, shut up if you don't.
But God don't hold it against you if you don't, I mean, if you make a mistake and you try to make it better.
Right.
God
You've
doesn't
corrected
hold
it,
against
correct. As long as you try to make it better, you're not pretending you're something you're not. See, that's another thing that happens. People make mistakes, their pride gets in the way, and they don't want to admit to it. Charlene?
If you humble yourself in the sight of the Lord,
Right.
okay, then you're willing to say, I'm human, I didn't quite have my back straight.
Right.
But can we do it together?
Exactly.
You know, type of thing. And you can get Bible studies started like that.
Exactly. And you got to remember, I'm up here teaching today, this morning. Jeff's doing it on Wednesday night, and whoever's doing it whenever. You also have an obligation. See, I have an obligation to do the very best I can to relay God's message. You have an obligation to do what? Study. To show yourself approved unto God. Isn't that what the Bible also says? So, if you lose your soul because you listen to a man, see, God ain't going to accept that as an excuse, is he?
Nope.
I know it's kind of blunt, but it's the fact. I can't get you to heaven, you can't get me to heaven. I can help. I can do everything in my power to help. But it's up to each of us as individuals to make sure we're doing the right thing. To make sure we understand.
One of the most profound experiences I had in a course I had to take this summer is this professor got up and she said, bear with me for 20 minutes. And she said, I'm going to start with the Methodist Church. And she went, the First Methodist Church, the Second Methodist Church. She went through all the names of the different Methodist churches. Then she went in other churches, and she went on for 20 minutes. And she said, I've only covered about a 16th of the churches in this country. You, as educators, cannot please everybody that walks into your classroom because of the different beliefs that they're bringing into, through their training. I think when we are reaching out to people that we hope that will come here, we have to remember that. We need to know what their background is and how do we correct that without insulting them.
Wow.
Well, and then some of that's going to come out in the lesson. It's funny you brought that up, but there are going to be times you are going to insult somebody. I'm sorry, but you will. Jill?
Well, since I was, a teenager, because they challenge, and a lot of times, it challenged me on instrumental music. And I was wrong on my thinking of that God never sanctioned it in the Old Testament, because that's what I had heard.
Right.
And then when I really went into it and studied it, I realized that, yeah, he did, but it was certain instruments for a certain time, by certain people, all those things, that it was his in the Old Testament.
Right.
So I think as a teacher, you can't get yourself all puffed up and not be questioned.
Right.
It's something that you may think that's right, and you can't do that. You have to, like Charlene said, humble yourself and listen to him. And I learned a lot about that, so I could teach somebody else that asked me that same question.
Right. And it definitely, we've talked about this in past, it's definitely a plus in favor of you if you're able to know the person that you're teaching. June?
If you look at the qualifications of an elder, I know that it applies to the eldership, but you look at some of the things that are in that, you could apply it to not a novice, a believer, one that professes a good reputation, that type of thing should be applied to someone that is standing before us.
Yella?
God has insulted Jews, He's insulted every religion except his own.
So if you're going to teach, if you're going to get that in a position, getting back to the text here, we need to make sure that we are teaching the truth. And it is one truth. That's it. As Jeff pointed out in Galatians, he makes that very clear. It says, and if anyone does not stumble in the ways he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. If we put bits in the mouth of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships. Also, though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the wheel of the pilot directs. So there's two prime examples. We're talking about our tongue. That's a weapon and a half, isn't it? It's a weapon and a half. And you look at horses with a bit in their mouth, and that 1,600-pound animal could take you out with no problem. But they learned, once they're controlled in the mouth, they learn to follow those leads. They've learned that pressure on the mouth, pulling back, makes them stop or slow down. Right and left. That pressure directs that horse because his mouth is controlling his whole body. And if you've ever seen, back years ago when the Queen Mary got docked in Long Beach, you could go take a tour through it. That's a big ship. And at the time it was being used, they used it also to transport soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean because it was faster than everything else. You go below and there's these massive props and then these little rudders. It's amazing how that perspective, I mean, it's big compared to, it's a big item, but compared to the size of that ship, it's nothing. Look at your tongue and compare it to the rest of your body. It's just a little member of your body. But yet, how many times do we let it control our lives? And of course, the problem here is it isn't exactly the tongue, but it's your mindset that directs your tongue. Jill.
In Psalms 32, going along with what you're saying, in verse 8, 9, I will instruct you and teach you in the way in which you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Do not be as the horse or as a mule, which have no understanding, whose trappings include bit and bridle, keep them in check. So that's what's holding them in check, because they don't understand like we should understand, right? And that you're saying it comes from your knowledge and wisdom, understanding. That what keeps us in check, right? The horse, the mule, the only thing that's keeping them in check really is that bit.
Right.
They don't understand what, I mean, you can train them, but it's different. Like with the boat, that little rudder, the boat doesn't understand, I mean, there's no understanding
Right.
there. But as us, right, we understand what we're supposed to be doing, but, whew.
And the horse learns. I mean, you think about this for a minute. Studying is a big part of us becoming a Christian. We need to know why. You just don't walk up to a young horse and put a bit in its mouth, right? You're probably going to get kicked and bit. It takes some work to work with that animal, to get him to trust you, and then allow him to do it. And when you get one in his mouth, is he happy about that? See, the same thing with Christians. Too many times, we just try to walk up to somebody and put a bit in their mouth, and then wonder why they're not going to accept it. We need to work with them. We get to know them like we talked earlier. We need to get to know them. But we can control, if we can learn to control our mouths, it says we can learn to control our whole body, like that horse. Yeah.
And then they begin to reveal things about them and let you come in.
Right.
To their life.
Yeah. Yubi?
I was on a small aircraft carrier for 2 years. We came back from overseas and went to San Francisco Naval Shipyard. And they put it in dry dock for overhaul and reconversion. Several of us walked back and looked at the rudder. This ship was 3 football fields long, small by today's comparison, over 1,000 feet. And the rudder was less than 20 feet.
Is that amazing?
It could change, and that ship could go 30 knots, and he could turn that ship like nothing.
Isn't that amazing?
So he's making a comparison about the tongue.
Yeah.
It's a little thing, and it can do so much damage. It's got so much power to destroy.
Well, and, we think about that. How much can it change your life? See, when the tongue spews out something, well, let's just look at lies. You tell a lie, and you think, well, it's harmless, right? It was not a big deal. But then somebody else brings it up. Now you got to remember what you said. And after a while, people start believing the lie. So there it becomes what 1 John says, you're practicing sin now, aren't you? And like we read in James, that gives birth to death, doesn't it? So we need to learn that our mind, our mind needs to be right, so our tongue can speak truth. And our tongue doesn't put somebody down. You know, that old saying, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That's about as false as it could be, isn't it? Nothing hurts worse than sharp words. And let's just be honest with each other. We might forgive somebody of doing that, but we don't forget. It's something that could haunt us a lot. We got to be careful. And that's why we have a whole chapter here in James talking to us about the tongue. And specifically here in teaching. The tongue can just mess everything up. Because when you come here to teach, or if you're going to teach somebody, you can't be making stuff up. You cannot tell them, sugarcoat the gospel. It cannot be watered down. Because once you water it down, are you now speaking the truth? You look at a lot of these drinks on the market. Do you ever notice, if you read the ingredients, the very first thing is water? And then they add a little bit of stuff in there to get you to like the taste of it better. But it's watered down. I've tasted lemonade and these little things that didn't taste like lemonade at all. It was sour, but that's about all it had in common. We can't let our Christianity be soured by watering it down. We've got to be careful. Excuse me. It says, verse 4, look at the ships also, they were so large and driven by strong winds, and they were guided by very small rudders wherever the pilot directs. Now, I want to bring out another point about that. You and I both mentioned modern ships. These ships were driven by what? The wind. The wind is a powerful source. And when you look at these ships, they're leaning into that wind. Yet the rudders still, those little rudders are still able to guide those big ships, even with the gale force winds. It shows how powerful the tongue can be.
Dan, if we look back in history, we can see men went to war because of words that were said. Thousands, if not millions, of lives over the course of history have been affected because of mere words.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a sad deed.
I was just thinking about in James 5:20 about preaching, and if you say the soul, the tongue can be the converse. It can do a lot of damage, but it can do a multitude of good. And the Bible talks about where, you know, the advantage if you convert a sinner, you know, hides a multitude of sins. It goes both ways.
Exactly. And that is the point he's going to make in a little bit. The tongue can be a blessing if used properly. Our faith can be a blessing if we have works. Our works can be a blessing if we have faith. See how all this ties together? Things work together for the good. What a perfect plan God has put together for us. What a perfect plan. I guess we'll stop there. And it stops at verse 5. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. We'll pick up on that next week. Appreciate all the comments.